Welcome to Hidden God, a Tulsa Bible Church resource and podcast where we explore issues of theology and culture in order to build healthy, relevant churches right here and across the world. For more information, see our website, tulsabible.org. Well, welcome to Hidden God, where we explore issues of theology, culture, in order to build healthy, relevant churches right here in Tulsa and around the world. Super excited to be with you today. Before we get going, I want to mention a couple things on our social media sites. We'd love it if you would check us out on our YouTube channel. It's youtube.com/Tulsa Bible Church, all one word at the end there. Our Instagram account is at Tulsa Bible, all one word. And our brand new website is up and running for the church, for Tulsa Bible Church, and it is tulsabible.org. Any of those ways are great ways where you can engage. Follow us, follow sermon links, resources that we have, and just see a little bit about some of the stuff that we got going online.
Yes, those are great. And this is season 2 of Hidden God. So if you want to access season 1, you can see all of that on Spotify or just go to the church website. We directly link you to it. But this is season 2. Season 1 was a ton of fun. Made fools of ourselves. I know I did several times. And now here we are kicking off season 1 with a little bit of YouTube video along with audio. And I think this is going to be a really, really good time.
So season 2, I'm going to shift from you making fun of yourself to me making fun of you. It's going to be the one change.
I'm looking forward to that. Man, this is great.
I should introduce, I'm Jared Verweel.
Oh, yeah, that would be good. I'm Daniel Newberry.
Your Highness.
Your Highness.
Royalty.
Carrying that over to season 2 as well.
That will carry over into every single season.
I'll kill it eventually.
It's going to be awesome. It's going to be so great. Got some fall temperatures rolling in.
Yes.
Really exciting things happening. Of course, we're in the middle of a political season here for the United States, which makes the newsworthy media just incredible. A lot of fodder out there for us.
For sure.
Today, but we want to start out with just a general topic to talk about, to discuss for our first episode of season 2 on transparency. And this is such a key topic for churches, for ministries across the board, for leaders, business leaders, any organizations. Transparency and vulnerability typically might hear of more of a negative association with those things. We're going to talk about a very positive view today.
Absolutely, yeah.
Man, have you ever heard of this? I want to start out with this illustration. The Barbara Streisand effect.
I think you might have told me about it the other day.
Okay, so I was listening. One of my favorite podcasts to listen to is called Stuff You Should Know. It's awesome. 2 guys, man, their personalities really shine through on their podcast, which is cool. But they talked about, they've got an episode, it's a quick hitter, 15-minute deal on the Barbara Streisand effect. I've never heard of this before. And I'm like, well, what is that? So apparently there was a media guy who was taking pictures for environmental causes, doing an environmental study. And she's got a beach house in Florida somewhere, I think it is. Don't even know really where it is, but finds out that somebody takes this aerial photo of her property, realizes that it's out there, and says, absolutely not. You do not have permission to take photos of my property. We're going to pull this right away. And I think when she got excited about it, or lack of better word, there was 6 views of this thing. And 2 of them were from herself,
right?
Just not a whole lot at all, just kind of worried about what might happen. So she responds and she sues this guy for $50 million.
Oh my gosh.
Just, hey, I don't want my stuff out there, whatever. It backfires on her. Everybody kind of clues into this big court case, Barbara Streisand, big name, media and famous and all this other kind of stuff. And so after the court case goes public, there's 500,000 downloads of her property. It goes from 6 to 500,000, basically because of the craziness. Fires back, it kicks back on her, goes the absolute opposite direction of what she wanted to happen.
Yeah.
And so the Barbara Streisand effect has become this idea of something goes public and it turns into something awful,
Right.
and it's almost like we don't want to be transparent. We don't want something to get out there. We don't want to show any vulnerabilities.
Mm-hmm.
So we're going to do everything we can to stop that. And if we do show any of that, it's a sign of weakness. It's something like that. You know?
Right.
But the other thing that came to mind I want to start out with on this whole topic was the great Wizard of Oz.
Oh,
you know,
such a good illustration there,
man. And right at the end of the video of the movie, you get this booming voice of a wizard. That's just this old guy sitting behind a curtain, talking into a very expensive machine.
Yes. Yeah. He portrays himself as something great, and that, like you said, it kind of backfires in the exact same way. He's not who he said he was, and now he has to live up to that.
Unbelievable.
Yeah, that is unbelievable. And you know, the thing about transparency is, like, modern ministries in America right now are really focusing on the idea of transparency. And I think that I would say a modern ministry is focusing on that, but a lot of churches in the U.S. have not addressed it. And I would say here at TBC, we've not addressed it in the professional sense. We've not said, hey, let's look at transparency and see exactly what that is, you know? And I think that that's why we're doing this episode today, is to say, here's what transparency is and why it's so important and how to apply it to our lives.
Right. I know it's big for you in the youth ministry. It's big for me personally as a leader, just to be vulnerable and to be transparent with whatever it might be related, especially in a ministry context. But why is transparency so crucial? Why do you think it is such a hot button item right now?
Well, I mean, okay, to begin with, you really got to start defining what is transparency to see why it's so important. I would say transparency is total honesty about who you are to anyone at all, you know? It's you're an open book. If you look at, like, any of Paul's letters to all the churches, I mean, he's completely transparent with them about who he used to be before he knew Christ, the kinds of struggles he's going through as a Christian, and the persecutions he faced, the temptations he faced. I do the things I don't want to do. That's absolute transparency right there. He's holding nothing back. And we see basically ministry is all about growth on a personal level. And you can't get personal with someone if you're not willing to show them the personal stuff, right?
Right.
And so, I mean, the idea here isn't like that everyone should know everything about you, but rather there should be someone in the church who does. There should be at least, you should know at Tulsa Bible Church, we've got at least one person here who I can be completely honest with about myself and be completely open with.
And I think that's solid. It's, you know, transparency, we don't expect you to be like super open, like have these great, close, intimate relationships with everybody.
Right.
But man, if you don't have that one-on-one person who knows you better than you know yourself in some ways.
Exactly.
I mean, that's a problem
in
the Christian life. Absolutely.
And like, the world is searching for truth. People are searching for truth. That's why the gospel is so attractive, is because it's the truth. And so if people are searching for the truth, then you can't have the truth without honesty. We need to be honest with them. No one's expecting perfection out of us.
Right.
They're expecting honesty out of us. If we can be honest, we can point to the perfection of Christ. That's why transparency is so important.
Yeah, I like that too. It's everybody expects you to be human.
Exactly.
Right. Everybody's going to make mistakes. I think we all understand that. There's weaknesses. There's areas that we're gonna make some mistakes with. But if we can be open about those and honest with people, no matter what it is, that goes a long way toward building trust.
Exactly. Yeah, and that's really how Paul. What's one way he was so successful with his ministry? If you look at 2 Timothy 3, chapter 3, verses 10 through 11, I mean, he says, Timothy, you knew me by my teaching. You knew me by my conduct and my faith, the way I loved people. You knew me by my persecutions. I mean, he says, you've known everything there is to know about me. You lived with me for several years doing all of this. You know me. Now you know how to do ministry. You know, Ministry is strengthened by transparency, because everyone knows, if I just saw only the perfect side of you, Jared, I would never know how to handle the stuff that sucks.
Right.
But because I've seen you struggle with all kinds of things, now I know how to handle that as well.
Yeah. Oh, and I've experienced this a lot, just workplace, ministry contexts, a ton, is guys who don't try to hide their mistakes, but just say like, man, I really messed up here. That's not necessarily a sign of like you're not capable of doing your job. You're not great even at doing your job. It's more of a sign if somebody says, if somebody makes a mistake, we say this a lot to the staff. Like, I don't care if you make a mistake, if you drop the ball somewhere. I just don't want to hear it from somebody else before I hear it from you.
Yeah.
You know, and
good.
so just come out and be honest about it. We'll laugh about it. We'll learn from it.
Right.
You know, we'll talk about what we need to do differently. But that's totally different than the person who's trying to portray like, man, I don't make any mistakes. You know, if anything happens, it's got to be that person or this thing that was the problem, but it wasn't me. You know, and that's, we all know that that's not human.
Right.
Number one, we're all susceptible to sin, to weaknesses. We're all prone to wander, as the hymn writer would say. And to embrace that and to live that out in a gospel glorifying God way, I think gives us way more trust and way more credibility.
Absolutely.
With people.
Absolutely. So what do you think are some of the biggest obstacles to transparency?
Oh my goodness. Yeah. There's a desire. All of us have a desire to portray somebody who is capable, who is more special, able to do things that other people can't do. All of us want to stand out among the crowd, right? And what's going to cause us not to stand out among the crowd is mistakes, blunders, image issues that we would have. So I think we just fight. I think one of the biggest obstacles to transparency is this idea that image is everything. You know, no matter what you do, make sure you protect the image at all costs. Yeah. Don't let anybody see any signs of weakness, anything like that. And it, you know, I don't know exactly even where that's come from, but it's this idea of if you're in a position of authority, you need to portray that authority in a very visible, perfect kind of way. And underneath all that, we all know that there's no perfect authority out there outside of God, right?
Yeah, right.
So that becomes an obstacle. We are people that are drawn to images, to these ideas. The one thing I would just go back scripturally to is Genesis 3. Man, the biggest obstacle to transparency is sin. And the fact that we have all become shamed, vulnerable to sin because of our relationship with Adam, because we are human beings. So I think it's Genesis 3:7, looking at this verse, after this Adam and Eve committed the first sin, then the eyes of both of them were open and they knew they were naked. So what's the first thing they try to do? Hide themselves. So they sewed fig leaves together to make coverings for themselves. And obviously the covering that they came up with was insufficient, right? Right at Genesis 3 verse 7, I love one guy puts it this way. This was the debut of fearing people, of fearing transparency. So immediately after the sin, you had a fear man before woman, woman before man. They were vulnerable. All of a sudden they wanted to cover themselves, hide themselves from each other. But the big exposure was their sin before God. And they did everything they could to try to hide from him, which is just mindless in and of itself. But that's what sin makes us do. And I love what one guy says. He says, the cornerstone of human experience is, what will people think of me? And then on top of that, we're concerned not just with what will people think of me, but what will God think of me? And so we try to hide.
Yeah.
Every day is Halloween. We're people behind masks, you know, and we put on our mask just like we put on our makeup or comb our hair in the morning. You know, it's time to put on portray this person, this image that's really not authentic.
Right.
That's not genuine.
That's great. I think so. Yeah. Like, and the thing is, people are never afraid of what people will think of them when it's something good to be known about them. You know, right. Well, if you succeeded and you did something really well, yeah, I'll let everyone know about that part of me. You know, it's the sin that we're ashamed of. And just like you said, that's really where shame started, was my sin is suddenly out there, and it creates this sense of vulnerability. All of a sudden, anyone can poke at that thing, and I'm weak in front of people, and not just weak, but I'm susceptible. I'm vulnerable to people now. I think a lot of it is we are trying to protect ourselves. Breen Brown, she does this phenomenal TED Talk.
Yeah.
I'm sure you've seen this.
Yeah, Brene, I think is how it's a real weird, interesting name.
I've talked to some. Yeah, I've heard it both ways.
Yeah,
I guess I should say. So Brene Brown.
Her TED Talk went viral almost immediately.
Yeah,
it's one of the highest hit TED Talks.
And it is phenomenal. The idea that vulnerability leads to closer relationships, and that's really what she's not. I don't even know if she was coming at it from a Christian perspective or not, but that's what we as believers are really focusing on, is the fact that it's hard to endure in your faith, and we have to have stronger relationships. And if you're not willing to be vulnerable with your fellow believers, you're not going to grow. That's just all there is to it. You can't grow without that personal relationship, that vulnerability. And transparency creates vulnerability.
Yeah. Yeah, she did a book. It's based on Roosevelt's quote. The man in the arena speech. It's not the man who's not in the arena that we should be concerned about. It's the guy who's getting beat up, who's bloody, who's marred by the things of life. You go back and look at Man in the Arena by Teddy Roosevelt. It's an amazing speech. And she wrote a book with a title from a phrase that comes from that speech. And she really flipped it upside down, where like the world looks at vulnerability, transparency as a weakness. She's like, actually, that's one of our greatest strengths. And if we're going to be real, true leaders, strong leaders, we need to embrace those vulnerabilities, be open about them, not try to convince people we're not somebody or somebody that we're not, kind of just be open and honest and real with people. And that actually gives us more credibility and more trustworthiness. And I think she's spot on. Yeah. Man, there's a lot of good stuff there.
Absolutely.
But this one book I love reading is When People Are Big and God is Small. It's by Edward T. Welch. He's a Christian counselor. And I just want to read some of this. Made some highlights in my copy here. It says, from Genesis on, nakedness or shame of being exposed to others became one of the great curses in Hebrew culture. And it was a profound curse because it symbolized the deeper spiritual nakedness and shame that needed covering. It symbolized that apart from God's covering, we stand naked before him. And so he talks about Noah. Remember, Noah was, after he came off the ark, he goes and he has the wine and becomes naked. Noah cursed the progeny of Ham because Ham had gazed upon his father's nakedness, perhaps laughing at his father, ridiculing him. When Job was in the midst of the greatest misery, he spoke of his dread and he cried, naked I came from my mother's womb. Naked I shall return. He was not simply resigned to the idea of death. Instead, he acutely sensed that his shame was exposed, and he himself was under the curse of sin. In Amos, there's a great verse 2, verse 14 and 16. The bravest among warriors will flee naked on that day, talking about the judgment day for Israel. Just a lot of really good biblical ideas that one of the reasons we're scared about vulnerability and being open and transparent with people is because we're guilty. Yeah. We're sinners.
Oh, yeah.
Right? And we all are susceptible to sinning again because of that. We don't want people to see that.
Absolutely. I absolutely agree. And I think that when the world looks at the church, they're looking for someone who's willing to talk about the thing they're ashamed of. I think at one point in time, several decades ago, the idea of professionalism in the church was the right idea. It was like, church is important. We must dress up for church. And that, I think, is a really, you hold it in that high of a standard, there's some value to that for sure. But where today's culture is people are open and honest with each other. Just look at social media. They're not hiding anything. And sometimes they're going too far with that.
Right.
Right. People, we're constantly open and sharing who we are. And when we look at the church, it's like, I have to, when I come to the knowledge that I'm disgusting and volatile on the inside and depraved, I'm looking to the church for someone to say, I'm that way too. we have a solution, and that's someone who's not. That's what people are looking for. And so I think just kind of getting to the idea of what are some obstacles, I would say professionalism in the church can be an obstacle. At one point in time, it had served its purpose, but today, someone walks in and they see it, and they're covered in tattoos, and they see the guy wearing a suit, and he's like got his hair combed back, and it's like, I don't really feel like I can fit in here and be open as to who I am.
Right.
You know?
Yeah, and there's been, it's you can't just say it's like an older way of thinking. I don't
Sure.
want to put the antagonism against older and younger,
right,
and all that kind of stuff. But yeah, I mean, you would have somebody in public office, somebody who is making a public speech, a presentation, a pastor, whatever it might be, and the first thing you do is you look the part,
right?
Because looking the part was so central. It was like this idea of, as an authority figure in the public eye, you need to look like you got your stuff together.
Yeah.
Right. And we've seen so many fallouts. We've seen moral failures from high profile people that our generation, speak for my own here, we're to the point where we know nobody has got their stuff together like that. As hard as we might want to portray it, the reality is, again, we all make mistakes. We all sin. We all fail. We fail ourselves. We fail God. And when those things happen, I think the response that we would like to see, we want to encourage, is more of the David to Nathan response rather than the Saul to Samuel response of, woe is me. I mean, yes, I have sinned. I did that. You know, Nathan says, David, you're the man. There's repentance there. There's conviction of sin. There's honesty and openness, right? When Samuel approaches Saul, what are you talking about? I mean, are you talking about the sheep that I've preserved for God's people? You know, the best of the flock, kind of, you know, excuses, whatever.
Right.
Our generation wants to see, you know, we desire that authenticity and that sincerity, that vulnerability brings.
Right. That's why you see so many vegans in our generation. They like the authentic food, you know.
Man,
getting tired of the crap.
That's right. That's right. We want the real thing.
That's right. Want the Impossible Whopper. No, I'm joking.
Oh my goodness. Let me ask this: how does the gospel compel us to transparency and vulnerability?
You know, the first place I'm definitely going to go to with that is Philippians chapter 2. When Paul says, you know, adopt the same attitude of Christ Jesus. He says that he was existing in the form of God, but he did not consider that form worth exploiting. Instead, he humbles himself as a human being, and he became relatable to us. God was at one point unrelatable to us in any way whatsoever, which is why he's so deserving of worship. But then he became something we can relate to. And he says in Hebrews chapter 4 that we have a high priest who knows our weaknesses and understands our weaknesses. Christ came as a man and died in that way, and he lived. He didn't just immediately die. He went through the whole process of living to understand what we understand, to know what we know. Not that he didn't already know, but you see what I'm saying? Now we can say, okay, I know Christ has experienced this temptation, and he was completely honest about who he was with his own disciples. There was no trying to put on a show for anyone. He just displayed himself. And we can say, now we know we can do the exact same thing, and we see how that works. And, you know, you can also, I would say, go to the cross. I mean, that's where he was most vulnerable. His entire life, he lived perfection, and that's why we look at him as the ultimate example, and we don't have to be perfection. But when he goes to the cross, still perfect, he suffers the consequences. He was naked on the cross. He was humiliated on the cross, and he took it all that shame for us, which is beautiful in and of itself. But now we see Paul, for example, is an example of a disciple who suffers persecution all his life and humiliation all his life, because that's part of what transparency is. Christ did it first on the cross. We do that in our lives now.
Yeah. And I love what Paul says, going back to imitating Timothy, or, you know, being open and vulnerable with Timothy, is he says, imitate me as I imitate Christ.
Right.
You know, and I think a big portion of that is, in our weaknesses we're made strong. Like, he was just being very open and vulnerable with who he was, his humanity, all of these things that he was compassionately and affectionately entering into ministry with people, so they could see, like, I am a real person.
Yeah.
Trying to live my life like Christ, just like you. are a person trying to live your life like Christ and to glorify him in that way. Those are like the incarnation and the gospel.
Mm-hmm.
You don't get much more vulnerable, exposed, humiliated, naked than Jesus on the cross. And first century, even today, we would look at that and say shame.
Yeah.
Totally shameful, totally guilty. This is a criminal hanging on a cross. Jesus says, man, this is my most glorifying moment.
Yeah.
Father, not as I will, but as you will. All I want to do is to glorify you in my life and in my death.
Yeah.
In resurrection, which is amazing. I got this verse from 2 Corinthians and in Paul, kind of the same way that he talks to Timothy, where he talks about how open and vulnerable he was to the Corinthian church. He says, we have spoken freely to you, 2 Corinthians 6:11. We have spoken freely to you, Corinthians. Our heart has been open wide to you. Like, my life has been wide open, basically. And then it says, our affection for you is not restricted. And I love that use of that word.
Yeah.
But you, he comes back to the Corinthians, he says, but you are restricted in your affections for us. So Paul was this guy opening his life, being extremely vulnerable with them.
Yeah.
He wasn't seeing the reciprocal relationship. He wasn't seeing them do the same. And he's saying ministry is reciprocating, you know?
Yeah.
Which is one of the points. I want to end with a couple principles here. Transparency and vulnerability has to start with leaders.
Yeah.
It has to start with the leader. If you're going to be in a ministry team, a small group Bible study, a Sunday school leader, whatever it might be, no, you can't expect anybody in that group to be vulnerable with you if you are not first vulnerable with them. You have to build the safety by the leader stepping out in vulnerability. I think that really is true. And we see that in the life of Christ.
Absolutely. And I would also say that transparency is a byproduct of integrity. You know, our goal is to build trust, right? And so if we're living our lives and we're doing this ministry for the sake of the gospel, for the sake of the people we're serving in the church, then our goal, that's integrity. And then our goal is to be transparent because of that.
Yeah. Yeah. Why would we want to hide something?
Right. Exactly.
You know, it builds suspicion, curiosity, like, what's going on behind the scenes here?
Right.
You know, but when you are open and like knowingly stating that you're being open with one another and showing that in your actions, it takes away that question mark. Yeah. You know, people aren't going to suspect. They're going to see a willingness to just be an open book. Yeah. And that's very commendable. Transparency, vulnerability must start with the leaders. Number one, it's a byproduct of integrity. Number two, we're trying to build trust. But then the last thing I want to mention is that vulnerability has value, but be wise. Be wise with it. Yeah. And by this, I mean, you don't just go around parading your issues with just anybody and everybody. Be smart about it. Right. You know, you're going to have a few people that you confide in that know some of the deepest struggles that you have. Right. Absolutely have to have that. You must have that in your Christian walk. The community of believers around you is a safety net, you know, for our accountability and for our growth in the faith. But be wise about what we're sharing and with who, and don't let people take advantage of that if they're incapable. And that's what we need to be cautious about in some respects as well.
And I think the fear of vulnerability in that sense can be useful at times, because there are people who would take advantage of that. And you want to acknowledge, okay, clearly I don't want to share this with everyone in this room. But like we said earlier, at least one person in the entire church, you can confide in 100%. That's the goal of transparency.
Right. And I'm just personally kind of wrapping this up. There's something about the openness of another person that it draws me to them. Yeah. It's a magnet.
Absolutely.
And I don't want to say like you can tell necessarily all the time who's being open and transparent, but there's a sincerity in many ways. If you're looking for certain things, if you're watching out for it, it really does manifest itself in character and interactions and dialogues with people. And I think that's something that we need to treasure and really, really build up in the church.
Oh, for sure. For sure. Well, thank you for tuning in for our first episode of Season 2 of Hidden God. If you have any questions at all or thoughts about what about this podcast or questions for this podcast, you can leave those in the comments of this YouTube video or send us an email at the church, and we'd be happy to go through those, maybe answer some of those questions on our next podcast. So, anything
I'm
else?
going to send you a comment.
You send me a comment.
Questions.
I don't want your comments. Get enough of those on a daily basis.
That's what we're going to start doing, a YouTube comment box for weekly staff interactions.
Yeah, no one wants to read that. All right. Thank you guys for joining us.
See you next time.